Hello and happy holidays, everyone. Welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and I have a bit of a Christmas gift for you. Maybe you're wrapping gifts, baking, cleaning, going to the grocery store. Well, I have just the thing to keep you company. What you'll hear tonight are 3 classic Victorian Christmas ghost stories told in my own words. Victorians considered the holiday season the best season for ghost stories. So, imagine sitting across from a cozy fireplace in a rustic but comfy chair, or maybe in a fine Victorian parlor where the heat and the light from the fire make the shadows dance about the room. But now, imagine what lays beyond the light and warmth of the fire. Darkness so black that anything could be looking back at you as you peer into it. The cold wind whips outside, then bursts through the cracks in the wood and brick construction and rattles the window panes. Suddenly, you lose a little faith in your safe, cozy fire. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. This first story is The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. It first appeared in a special Christmas edition of the weekly periodical Household Words in 1852, which was edited by Charles Dickens. The old nurse who relates the old nurse's story to us is named Hester, and the story takes place when she was not so old, but hardly a girl of 18. She was only a student when one of the fine ladies in her town came to her school and asked the headmistress if any of her students would make a suitable nurse's maid, as she was soon expecting a baby. The lady's name was Mrs. Furnival, and the headmistress recommended Hester to her. Now, Mrs. Furnival would go on to hire Hester, and Hester would stay with the Furnival family for generations, going on to raise the children of the young baby whom she not even yet met. And this is who she's telling the story to as an old woman now, these small children gathered around her feet on a cold winter's afternoon. Back to Hester's meeting with Mrs. Furnival, though. Mrs. Furnival hires her right away and shortly thereafter gives birth to a beautiful baby girl they name Rosamond. And all is lovely. Miss Rosamond is a wonderful baby adored by her mother. When Rosamond is about 4 or 5, Mrs. Furnival found herself expecting another baby. But the family would soon be met with tragedy. Just before the baby was about to be born, Mr. Furnival returned home cold and soaked from a ride in the rain and was soon taken ill with a fever. He would not recover. And so poor little Miss Rosamond lost her beloved papa. And Mrs. Furnival was terribly grief-stricken. So much so that only a few short weeks later, the baby came early but was stillborn. Hester was there for the birth and recalls the heart-wrenching scene as the baby was placed in Mrs. Furnival's arms, only to watch Mrs. Furnival herself fade away with the baby on her chest. And so little Rosamond lost both her parents within a month. The family was shocked. Mrs. Furnival's cousin and Mr. Furnival's brother came to settle the estate, and it was then that Hester learned that she and young Rosamond would go to live at Furnival Manor in Northumberland. At first, Hester quite liked the idea that Miss Rosamond would spend part of her youth about the same halls that her own mother had grown up in. But she soon learned that most of the family had left Furnival Manor at least 50 years ago, and the only resident there now was an elderly, reclusive great-aunt. All the same, there is not much Hester could do nor say except ready Miss Rosamond for travel. And travel they did, nearly a full day before arriving at the manor. It was a long ways from the nearest town they'd come through, with the countryside rolling on for miles and miles beyond it. The carriage lane was heavily wooded, but upon approaching the manor, the large semicircular driveway cleared to reveal an impressive brick manor with wings to the left and right of the central hall. A single butler greeted Hester and Rosamond in the large, dim hall. There were fireplaces, but none were lit. There was also a huge organ built directly into the wall with the door to the west wing on one side. Across the hall was the door to the east wing, and this is where Hester and Rosamond were led. They were relieved to finally be shown to a cozy, cheerful nursery, which they would share. Soon thereafter, they were introduced to the middle-aged housekeeper, Dorothy, who was quite pleasant, as well as the cook, Betsy, who was also warm and pleasant. And finally, they met the great-aunt, Miss Furnival, who was all but deaf, and her lady's maid/companion, Mrs. Stark. The 2 stern women passed their days working at their tapestries in the study. It took a while for Hester and Rosamond to settle in, but by and by, they brought a little bit of life back to the house. As they got comfortable, so long as the weather was dry, the two of them would bundle up and go exploring out on the hillsides. They found an ancient, gnarled holly that became a favorite picnic spot. And when the weather kept them confined to the house, they explored the rooms of the east wing. But never the west wing. The west wing was locked up tight, and no one ever entered it. No matter, though, they had more than enough to explore in the vast east wing alone. One day, Hester, housekeeper Dorothy, and Rosamond were poking about one of the gallery rooms. Dorothy, who had been with the family much longer, was identifying portraits and sharing the history of the Furnivals so much as she knew. When she came to a portrait of a beautiful, proud young lady, Hester was surprised to learn that it was a sister of great-aunt Miss Furnival. Hester was struck by her beauty. Dorothy said to her in a low voice, "Miss Furnival has a portrait as well. I'll show you so long as you don't let Rosamond see." Hester could not imagine why a portrait like any other one upon the wall should be kept from a child, but all the same, she sent Rosamond on a quest of some sort to keep her occupied. Then Dorothy led her to a large, unhung portrait turned to face the wall. The two women rotated the portrait, then stepped back to take a look at it. It was Miss Furnival, all right, but a much younger woman wearing a deep royal blue gown with eyes to match. She was even more beautiful than her sister, except for a somewhat unsettling sneer barely detectable on her upper lip. Something about the sneer in the eyes made Hester's blood run cold. Dorothy said they ought to put the portrait back where they found it, and Hester quickly agreed. That night, Hester couldn't stop thinking about the Furnival family and their mysterious bad fortune. First, she'd been witness to the tragedy that befell Miss Rosamond's parents, and viewing the portrait today told her there must be something else unsavory in the family's past, though she had no idea what it could be. Whatever it was, she resolved herself to protect Miss Rosamond from it with her entire being. But Hester had yet to learn exactly what she was up against. As fall turned to winter and storms began to blow across the rolling hillsides, Hester would often find herself awakened by a sound. She had to press her ear to the floor to make out what it was, but she soon realized what she was hearing was organ music coming from the main hall. Or was it just the wind? No, it was music. She could hear it rise and fall separately from the wind and discern a melody. Could someone really be playing that organ in the dead of night in that dark hall? At first she said nothing, assuming it was bound to come up in conversation the mornings after, but it never did. Finally, Hester couldn't take it anymore and brought it up herself to Dorothy, who firmly told her it was the wind she was hearing, nothing less and nothing more. Surprised, Hester tried asking the cook Betsy about it, who she found more receptive. In a hushed voice, Betsy told her that she had heard it too, and it was not the wind. Some say it was the old Lord Furnival playing, Miss Furnival's father. This chilled Hester to the bone. As Miss Furnival was firmly in her 80s, her father, old Lord Furnival, had certainly been dead and buried for some time. Though this frightened Hester, she was so sure of her senses that she knew she was hearing organ music. Maybe Betsy was telling stories, or maybe she was just mistaken, or maybe Hester was just confused. Was there another Lord Furnival in the house? It was so big that it wasn't really impossible to conceive that a whole other person might be living there. Though she knew she shouldn't, Hester needed to look into this for herself. One day shortly thereafter, when Rosamond was preoccupied in the study visiting with the old ladies, when Hester was sure she was quite alone, she made her way to the entry hall. And with heart racing and hands trembling, she lifted the cover of the organ keys. She saw that they were destroyed and smashed. No one was playing this organ. Yet, someone was. Did she trust her eyes or her ears? Hester was not so sure she could trust either anymore. That night, though, as the wind blew up the hillsides as fierce as ever, Hester made sure that she and Miss Rosamond were both shut tightly in their chambers as quickly as possible after dinner, and she resolved not to come out until the morning's light was streaming in. Later on, Hester awoke to the sound of the organ playing, wilder than ever. A day or so later, Hester was seated in the study with old Lady Furnival and Mrs. Stark assisting with their tapestry work, while Rosamond busied herself nearby. To everyone's surprise, Miss Furnival, who seldom spoke due to her deafness, quite suddenly looked up and clearly remarked, "I feel it will be a very bad winter." Mrs. Stark paid her no mind, though something about the statement made Hester's skin crawl. And she was not the only one who seemed to feel so. When she looked at Rosamond, the little girl was looking right at her with alarm in her eyes, looking to see Hester's reaction to guide her own. Hester smiled warmly at the little girl, who visibly relaxed, but shortly thereafter, she whisked her away to the kitchen for a snack, away from the strange old ladies. Miss Furnival was right about the winter, though. Not even a week later, Betsy and Hester were discussing heading to town for church. Betsy thought it felt like snow, but she'd go so long as Hester was willing to venture out into the cold with her. So Hester left Rosamond in the study with the old ladies, letting them know that Dorothy was expecting them to ring when they were ready for her to come get her. And away they went. Despite being midday, the sky was dark and heavy with clouds. While in church, the snow started to come down. And by the time service had ended, the ground was covered and a bitter wind had blown away the cloud cover to reveal an early rising moon. By the time the two women arrived back to the Furnivall Manor, the sun had set. Hester was anxious to warm herself by the fireside. She went to find Dorothy in the kitchen and collect Rosamond, but to her surprise, she wasn't with her. In fact, Dorothy let her know that she hadn't seen Rosamond all day. Could she have really stayed in the study with old Miss Furnivall and Mrs. Stark the whole time? Hester hurried to the study where the two old women hardly glanced in her direction as she entered. A game, she thought. This must be a game. Rosamond must be hiding in here somewhere and enlisted the two old ladies to help hide her. Hester began to circle the room, moving aside draperies and peeking under tables. She strained her ears to hear giggling or rustling, but she couldn't see or hear any traces of the little girl. She'd been at this for some time before Mrs. Stark sharply asked her what she was doing. "Why, looking for Miss Rosamond," Hester responded. Mrs. Stark informed her they hadn't seen the girl for hours. Hester felt her stomach clench and excused herself politely enough, though as soon as she was out of the study, she flew to the kitchens where she informed Dorothy and Betsy that she didn't know where little Miss Rosamond was. The two women stopped what they were doing at once, and the three of them made a quick sweep of all of her usual spots in the manor. Soon the butler and footman were searching too, leaving no room unturned. Having checked everywhere except for the locked west wing, Hester made a second pass back through all of the rooms. At this rate, even old Miss Furnivall and Mrs. Stark had left their precious study to help search. Hester was standing upstairs in the nursery, assuring herself that the girl must be in the house, when she spotted a set of small footprints in the snow illuminated by the moonlight. She had no memory of how she got there so quickly, but all at once she was bursting out the front door into the night with not so much as a cape or cloak. The footprints were real. She lost them for a moment in the shadow of the house, though the moonlight revealed them once again, leading all the way out to the open, pitch-black hills they'd once wandered on warmer days. Hester was fortunate that the moon reflected off the snow enough to see where she was going as she stumbled further and further from the house. She was sure she could not last out here much longer. If she herself could hardly stand it, she dreaded to think what fate had befallen her poor little Rosamond. And then she spotted something moving in the distance. It was a shepherd with a bundle in his arms. Hester raced towards him, tears and cold stinging her face, and as she neared, she knew it was Miss Rosamond in his arms. He said, "Let me carry her back to the house for you," as he could see Hester, every limb trembling with cold and fear, was in no state to be out there either. But no, Hester could not live a second more until little Rosamond was back safe in her own arms. She gathered the little girl from the shepherd, and they both raced back to the manor together. Hester ran straight to the nursery and laid her by the fireside, and she slowly began to come around, waking long enough to assure Hester that she was going to pull through. So Hester laid her in her warm bed and sat up and watched the dear little girl sleep soundly for the rest of the night. In the morning, she awoke fresh as a daisy, and Hester was greatly relieved, though she realized that for the first time in nearly her entire life that she'd have to scold the little girl. She asked Rosamond to explain herself. That's when Rosamond told her that the day before, she'd tired of the old ladies in the study and started to make her way to Dorothy in the kitchen when she saw a little girl crying outside the window in the snow. Rosamond went on to tell her that she was such a pretty little girl, almost her own age, a little younger perhaps, and she was so sad. So she went out to her, and the little girl took her hand and started to lead her away from the house, to the old gnarled holly she and Hester had frequented, for a picnic. Hester's first reaction was anger that Rosamond was clearly making this up, as she'd seen only one set of footprints in the snow. Upon hearing this, though, Rosamond broke down into tears, insisting she was telling the truth. What could Hester do but comfort the child? It was not long after the two went down to breakfast when Hester was summoned to the study. She was sure she was about to catch hell from Miss Furnivall and Mrs. Stark, but she steeled herself for a confrontation, as she had left Rosamond in their care after all. Hester had to shout nearly as loud as she could directly into Miss Furnivall's ear to relate what the little girl had told her. When she was done, though, instead of berating her, Miss Furnivall began to openly weep. She then began to plead with her, "Hester, keep her from that child. It will lure her to her death. That evil child, tell her it is a wicked, naughty child. Oh, have mercy, wilt thou never forgive?" Mrs. Stark jumped up and hurried Hester out of the room before shutting the door firmly behind her, no doubt to try and tend to the hysterical Miss Furnivall. After this, as the winter wore on, Hester did not dare let Rosamond out of her sight for a second. Now, in addition to sequestering themselves in the nursery after supper, they made it a rule to draw all the curtains tightly as soon as dusk began to fall, for fear Miss Rosamond might see something outside the windows again. One day, just before Christmas, while playing in the billiard room, the house had just begun to darken within, which was Hester's cue to shut the drapes and ring for supper, when Miss Rosamond suddenly pointed towards the window and exclaimed, "Oh, there's my little girl." Hester followed the child's gaze, and her blood turned to ice as she too witnessed a little girl outside the window. She was pale with wild hair and tears streaming down her face, beating the window pane with her tiny fists. Rosamond cried, "Oh, she's so cold, we have to let her in," and started to run towards the window. At that moment, Hester realized she couldn't hear a single sound the child was making. If this was a real child, she should have heard the pounding on the glass and the crying. Rosamond clearly did, but she did not. Whatever sounds this child was making were intended only for Rosamond. Hester quickly closed the distance between her and Rosamond and intercepted the little girl, sweeping her off her feet. She hauled her out of the room, slamming the door behind them, and took Rosamond straight to the kitchens, where she told Dorothy and Betsy to shut the back door and bolt it. The two women did immediately as Hester said, then turned all of their attention to the sobbing Rosamond. Rosamond was bereft that Hester had left her poor little girl outside in the cold and was desperate to get back to her. They tried to calm her with snacks and treats from the kitchen, but she would not settle. Eventually, Hester took her up to bed, where the little girl finally fell asleep, still weeping. After she was asleep, for the first time in months, Hester left her side and went directly back downstairs, where she informed Dorothy that she herself would take Rosamond away from that dreadful house for her own sake. She'd take her to her own family's house far away from that place and the ghostly child who tempted her to her own demise. And what's more, she knew Dorothy knew more than she had told her. Dorothy had kept it to herself, and now they had almost lost Miss Rosamond not once, but twice. How dare she? And it was at this point that Dorothy sat down to tell Hester everything she knew. She had heard this tale from neighbors who used to frequent Furnival Manor when it was in its heyday, back when she had just come to work at the house. This was when the now elderly Miss Furnival was a young lady who they called Miss Grace. She had a younger sister, Miss Maud. Hester knew this history as she'd seen both portraits in the gallery. Their father, old Lord Furnival, was as proud of his two beautiful daughters as anything. And as they came of age, when most parents would be arranging a suitable marriage, old Lord Furnival did not, for no one was nearly good enough for his daughters. Possibly the only thing old Lord Furnival loved more than his daughters was music. He himself was a musician and could play almost any instrument handed to him. It was he who had had the large pipe organ installed in the great entry hall. The old lord loved music so much that he wanted the house to be filled with music at all times, so he would hire musicians to play all hours of the day. One summer, he hired a handsome young foreign musician to play in the manor, and both daughters fell in love with him. Being he was only a lowly musician, though, their father would never entertain the thought of either girl marrying him. Young love is not to be stopped, though, and after returning for a few summers in a row, the younger sister, Miss Maud, seemed to have won out over her sister for the young handsome musician's affections. This caused a bitter rift between the sisters. That summer, though, Miss Maud became pregnant. She invented a reason to go live at another home belonging to the family for a while, but this was a cover-up. It was somehow arranged that she would go stay at a house fairly close by in the countryside to have her child. Miss Maud gave birth to the child, a little girl, but eventually had to return home to Furnival Manor. The next summer, the handsome musician returned, and they're said to have been married. Once a week, Miss Maud would gallop as fast as she could into the countryside to be with her daughter, who was otherwise entrusted to a young farm couple as a ward. Miss Maud knew this was not her father's plan, but by and by, her father had grown sick, and she thought that once he was gone, she could live freely with her husband and daughter in Furnival Manor. One summer, the handsome musician returned as usual, but this time it was not the reunion Miss Maud had hoped for. He made it clear that he had no intention of recognizing the child, nor their marriage, after which he returned to his home country and was never seen again. After his final departure, the truth about the musician and Miss Maud came out to Miss Grace, which made matters even worse between them. The sisters took to living completely separate lives in the manor, Miss Grace in the East Wing and Miss Maud in the West Wing. That winter, Miss Maud was thinking of her little girl out on the cold farm and how she herself sat alone in the West Wing in the manor. She saw no reason why she shouldn't go and get her little girl and move her into the West Wing with her. And that's exactly what she did. This was to end badly, though. Miss Grace learned of the child staying with Miss Maud in the West Wing and told the truth to their ailing father. The nature of his illness, though, was that while he was still fairly sound in body, he was no longer very sound in the mind. So when he learned that his daughter had given birth to an illegitimate child that she had concealed and then brought to his own home, he was filled with rage and at once went to seek out Miss Maud and the little girl in the West Wing. That night, the winds were blowing violently across the hills and caused the house to creak and groan with relentless gusts. The winds were so loud that at first, everyone in the house mistook the wailing for just that, the wind. But soon, the staff started to hear the cries of a child amidst the wind. And then they heard the old lord shouting, almost as loud as the bellowing of the organ which he played. It was said that the few staff of the house rushed to the grand entryway to try and locate the screaming, and that's when they saw the doors of the West Wing burst open and tumbling out came Miss Maud, with a little girl clinging to her. Behind her was her father, the old lord, brandishing his crutch like a weapon. Miss Maud stood firmly between him and her little girl, begging and pleading with him, but he rushed at the mother and child and beat the little girl with his crutch before forcing the pair of them out into the bitter black night. The whole time the horrifying, frenzied event was taking place, Miss Grace had stood at the entry to the West Wing that her sister and young niece had just been forced through, and she watched. She said not a word or even made any gesture. She watched her father striking the child and then turning them both out into the cold, all the while with a passive and prideful look on her face. When it was done, she closed the door to the West Wing and retreated to her study. The old lord was helped back to bed, exhausted from the ordeal, and no one ever spoke of the night again. Not even when the news came out that Miss Maud had been found, seated on the roots of the great old holly tree, half frozen, clutching the dead girl in her arms. The shock of the event, it seems, had driven her mad, though, for she did not seem to know that her baby had passed. After that, no one knew what became of her, though old Lord Furnival died within the year, and Miss Grace went on to continue living in Furnival Manor alone, just as she was today. This story frightened Hester to her core, but she was glad she at least knew what she was dealing with now. The winter wore on, and Hester continued to hear the strange organ music at night, and every so often, little Rosamond would suddenly look up from her playing and ask Hester if she heard the little girl crying. Then she would try to go to her. But Hester doubled her resolve to never leave Miss Rosamond alone. One day, just after New Year's, Hester sat by Rosamond as she was napping when the bell calling her to the study was rung. Though it was inconvenient, she didn't dare to leave Rosamond, so she gathered her up out of bed and carried her down to the drawing room. Mrs. Stark told her Miss Furnival wanted her to undo a section of the tapestry she didn't like the result of. Hester glanced at Miss Furnival, who, as usual, appeared to not have even noticed that Hester had entered the room. Either way, Hester set the still sleeping Rosamond down on a sofa and started in on the section of tapestry. The house was silent except for the quiet crackling of the fire and the gusts of wind that rattled the window panes. Suddenly, Miss Furnival sat up so straight, Hester wondered how her back didn't break and exclaimed, "I hear voices." Hester and Mrs. Stark looked sideways at one another, each unsure what to do. Then Miss Furnival cried out, "I hear my father." At that moment, Rosamond jolted awake and began to exclaim herself that she heard her little girl. She was crying and cold, and she had to go to her. And for a moment, Mrs. Stark and Hester were so alarmed by the rising cries of both Miss Furnival and Rosamond, both clearly hearing things they could not, neither of them had any idea what to do. It was Miss Furnival who finally acted, rising and opening the door to the study and traveling at a pace Hester had never seen her move at, into the great entryway. Mrs. Stark followed, and afraid to be left alone, Hester picked up Rosamond and went after them. And that was when she heard it too. What she had first interpreted as wind had turned into voices. Or rather, the voices had wrenched themselves from the wind to become audible and discernible as voices, though Hester could not make out what they were saying, for they were all crying, the crying of a woman and a little girl and the enraged bellows of a man. Hester was positively frozen with fear, but Rosamond, little Rosamond, kicked and twisted and pushed at Hester. She was trying to get away, adamant that she must get to her crying little girl. Hester fell to her knees for fear of dropping little Rosamond, but she still held her tight. Suddenly, the locked door to the West Wing burst open, and with an icy gust of wind, the figures of a woman and little girl tumbled into the hall. Following them came a man with so much hate in his eyes, all those witnessing the events shrank back, even Rosamond, who was still desperately trying to break free. "Oh, father," cried Miss Furnival, "spare the little child." But her pleas were no good, because she could not change the past. For the next figure to appear on the door was a very young Miss Furnival, and the look in her eyes was worse yet than her father's. And the living watched as the awful scene from the past played out in front of them until the screams blended back in with the wind, which had grown so intense that the fire and every light in the hall had gone out. And by the time anyone realized that the wind had turned back into normal wind, gusting feebly in comparison to moments before at the window panes, Miss Furnival was found laying on the hall's floor. She'd suffered a stroke and was carried to bed that night. She would never leave her bed again, where she would lay facing the wall, muttering, "Alas, alas, what is done in youth can never be undone in age. What is done in youth can never be undone in age." The next story is called The Monkey's Paw. It was first published in 1802 by W. W. Jacobs. It was a cold, wet night outside the White household. Darkness had fallen almost unnaturally early, prompting Mrs. White to tend the fire more frequently than usual. She wanted it burning nice and hot when their visitor arrived. The visitor was an old friend of her husband's, Sergeant Major Morris. The pair had attended school together, and whereas Mr. White had gone on to eke out a reasonably comfortable living, Major Morris had achieved great success as a military man, then a businessman whose endeavors took him all over the world. At this point in the evening, Mrs. White was knitting by the fire while her husband and grown son, Herbert, played a game of chess. Mr. White used to be able to beat his son at chess with one hand tied behind his back, but young Herbert had become quite the skilled player as he'd grown and was now, much to his father's chagrin, a formidable match. Mr. White had just realized a mistake with his last move, and in an attempt to distract his son, he remarked, "Would you listen to that wind out there?" "Yep, I hear it," Herbert replied, focusing on his next move. "I wonder if he'll even make it out here tonight," Mr. White wondered aloud about Major Morris. Recognizing that Herbert had spotted his mistake, he suddenly hollered, "That's the problem with living out here. The roads aren't maintained and it makes it impossible to get around. They think because we're only one of a few out here, it doesn't matter." Mr. White's last-ditch effort to throw off his opponent, though true, did little to break his son's concentration, and in 2 more turns, Herbert had his father beat. Mr. White caught a knowing glance exchanged between his wife and son, a bit of a smirk at his expense, but before he could scold them about it, he heard the gate at the end of the walkway bang, and he knew his friend had arrived. Mr. White met him at the door and immediately ushered him to a chair by the fire to warm himself against the cold and blustering night. The men drank whiskey as Major Morris regaled the White family with stories of his travels to exotic lands with strange customs and people. "I'd like to go to India myself one of these days," remarked Mr. White, "just to see it." "You're better off where you are," Major Morris replied, tipping his glass in a knowing manner. "What was that one story you told that time? Something about a monkey paw?" At this, Major Morris froze. Recovering, he said, "That's nothing worth hearing about," and took a somewhat hasty gulp of his drink. "What's this about a monkey's paw?" Mrs. White asked, her curiosity piqued. "It's something they thought was magic," the Major replied dismissively. "Magic?" Herbert exclaimed. The 3 listeners leaned forward keenly. Sighing, the Major went on. "It's literally just a mummified monkey's paw." After a moment's hesitation, he reached into his pocket and proffered the object itself. Indeed, it was a small, black, knobby monkey's paw. Mrs. White jumped back, but Herbert reached out and took it from him. An old fakir, a very holy man, put a spell on it. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. This gave the Whites a laugh, but their jovialness quickly faltered when they saw the unexpected graveness of the Major's expression. The room fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was that of the crackling fire and the wind outside. "Did you make 3 wishes, sir?" asked Herbert. Staring into the fire, the Major responded almost inaudibly, yes, he had. "And did you have your wishes?" Mrs. White asked then. "I did," the Major answered. "Why do you still have it then?" Mr. White asked. At this, the Major inhaled and sat back and replied, "I don't know. I thought about selling it, but it's caused some mischief already, so I thought maybe I'd better hang on to it for safekeeping." The Major held the paw up in front of his face between his thumb and forefinger, then suddenly flung it into the fire. The White family all jumped at once, and Mr. White quickly fished the monkey's paw out. "Well, if you don't want it, just let me have it then," Mr. White said. "You'd be better off to destroy it," the Major said seriously. With a flourish, Mr. White straightened himself in front of the fire and said, "Well, how do I wish?" His wife and son laughed, but the Major only shook his head and told him not to blame him for what might happen if he kept it. "Wish for another pair of hands for me," said his wife, "so I can get this dinner on the table faster." Mr. Morris stood suddenly out of his chair. "No," he said. "If you wish, just wish for something sensible." After this, Mrs. White did get dinner on the table, and the earlier conversation was forgotten, including the strange mood that had come over all of them. After the door closed behind Major Morris later that evening, though, Herbert said, "Well, if the story of that monkey's paw is half as true as the rest of his stories, I doubt we'll get much out of it." At this, Mr. White picked the monkey's paw up off the side table and examined it. His wife asked if he'd given Major Morris any money for it. He said he had, and she scolded him for his frivolous spending. "Wish to be an emperor, father, then you won't have to answer to mother's nitpicking." His mother swatted at him playfully with a rag, and his father said no, it has to be something sensible, remember? He stood thoughtfully, turning the paw over in his fingers. "Well, wish for 200 pounds then. Then we can own our house," said Herbert. His father smiled with amusement, held the paw up before him, and said, "All right then, I wish for 200 pounds. Then came a sound that startled them all as Mr. White fell back against the piano, causing a loud crash. His wife and son whipped around to see what was the matter, and to their astonishment saw the older man, white as a ghost, pointing at the monkey's paw that now lay on the carpet at his feet. "It moved," he shouted. "It what?" exclaimed his wife. "It moved, the paw," he reiterated, leaning over to peer at it on the floor. "It did not. You just thought it moved," his wife tissed him. "No, it really did," said Mr. White, crouching down now to look more closely at it. He reached out a hand and tentatively poked at the monkey's paw with an extended forefinger. Realizing the ridiculousness of what he was saying, he plucked up his nerve and quickly picked the paw up off the floor. He slowly brought it closer to his face. "You're right," he said, examining the paw. "I must have imagined it." He stood up straight and set the paw aside on the sideboard, glancing back at it once before heading to pour himself another whiskey. For the rest of the evening, Mrs. White knit by the fire while Mr. White finished his pipe. The bang of the gate in the wind caused Mr. White to startle more than once. His uneasiness was contagious, and despite the glowing fire, a heaviness settled over the entire house. Eventually, Mr. and Mrs. White announced they were headed up to bed. "Good night," said Herbert. "Keep an eye out for the delivery of your money tonight," he joked. Herbert sat up a while, listening to the wind wail and watching the flames dance and flicker in the fire. He imagined he saw shapes of animals and faces formed in them. The draft was strong that night, and despite the quickness of the flames, he gazed into one spot longer than usual that seemed to be stiller than the others. In that, he saw a face emerging, a horrible, twisted face, so frightening that he reached blindly for a glass of water beside him and flung it on the fire. After this, Herbert decided he'd better go to bed as well. The next morning was brisk, bright, and clear, and whatever had come over the house the night before had dissipated in the sunlight. The family had come to see the events of the night before in a new light, and even had a laugh at Major Morris's expense. "These businessmen will say anything to make a buck sometimes," Mrs. White said. "Even so, how could 200 pounds hurt anyone?" "It could fall out of the sky and land on you," Herbert joked. Mrs. White rolled her eyes at her son as he headed out the door to his job at Ma and Megan's factory. Mr. and Mrs. White passed the day as they usually did, and just before supper time, took a minute for themselves to sit down and rest. "Herbert will expect you to have 200 pounds when he gets home," Mrs. White said sarcastically. "You know, it's the strangest thing. I really thought I felt it move," Mr. White said. "Exactly," said his wife. "You thought you felt it." "Well, I did," Mr. White went on. "I held it like this, and then Is something the matter?" Mr. White noticed his wife had stopped listening to him and had turned her attention to something going on out of their front window. Mr. White looked as well, and down the lane they saw a nicely dressed young man who seemed to be pacing back and forth in front of their gate. He passed by 3 or 4 times before resolutely turning toward their house and pushing open the gate. Mrs. White rose and met the man at the door and ushered him inside. She and her husband waited patiently for the man to tell them his purpose, as his dress and manner clearly indicated he was from a class above their own. Finally, after awkward handshakes and how-do-you-dos, the man announced he was from Ma and Megan's factory where Herbert worked. Mrs. White's hands flew to her face. "What is it?" she begged. "What's happened? Is Herbert okay?" "Settle now," said Mr. White, trying desperately to be the more level-headed of the two. "Don't jump to conclusions. It's possible this may be good news." The man swallowed hard and looked down. "I'm sorry," he said. "Has he been hurt?" Mrs. White rushed forward. "He has," said the man, "but he's not in any pain." "Oh," cried Mrs. White and collapsed into a chair. Thank goodness, he's not—" She broke off suddenly. In her desperation, she mistook his meaning, but she understood now. She understood. Her boy was dead. "No," she began to wail. "No, no, no." "He was caught in the machinery," the man from Ma and Megan said in a low voice. Mr. White ran to his wife's side, and fighting with everything he had in him to maintain his composure, he comforted his wife. Then, to the man from Ma and Megan's, he said, "He was the only child we had left. It's hard, you understand." The representative from Mom Maggins looked about ready to break himself and replied, "Of course, of course." Then, as if suddenly remembering his purpose, he stated the firm wished to convey their deepest sympathies, though would take no liability. They did wish to compensate the family with a sum of money, though. At this, Mr. White bolted to his feet. "What sum?" he said. "How much?" he asked desperately. £200, the man responded. At that, Mr. White did not hear his wife scream as he had passed out cold onto the floor. Things happened quickly after that. The Whites did receive their £200. Mr. White had to identify the body of his son, but he wouldn't let his wife see. It was too much. The equipment he'd been caught and had, well, they were lucky they had anything left to bury. They buried Herbert in the new cemetery 2 miles away and afterwards moved through their days mechanically. About a week and a half later, Mr. White awoke in the night and realized his wife was not in bed. He heard her nearby, though, gently weeping. "Come back to bed. You'll get cold," he said softly. "Not as cold as my sweet Herbert," she replied. A fresh wave of tears washed over her. Mr. White knew he ought to get up and go to her. He was in as much pain as she was, if not more. Had he caused this? Had he caused this with his wish? He dismissed the thought at the same moment that it occurred to him and told himself to think of something else, anything else. In his effort to distract himself, he did not get up and go to his wife, but rather drifted off back to sleep in the warm bed. But then he was startled awake again, this time by his wife at his bedside, clutching his shoulders. "The paw," she cried. "The paw, do you still have it?" Struggling to come fully awake, he responded, "What?" "Yes." She clapped and laughed. She didn't sound like herself. "Bring it to me, I want it," his wife said maniacally. "What in God's name for?" he asked. "2 wishes," she said frantically. "We have 2 more wishes. I only just thought of it now." All at once, his blood ran cold, and he understood her meaning. "Go get it," she demanded hysterically. "Go get it now and wish our boy alive again." Mr. White began to shake his head as if trying to shake the next thoughts away. "He's been dead 10 days, his voice shook. "You didn't see him before. If he was too terrible to look upon then how will he look now?" Mrs. White gripped his arm and yanked him out of bed with the strength that an old woman should not have, and said, "Do you think I fear my own child that I nursed? Bring him back." His wife was not in her right mind. She was mad with grief. Perhaps he saw no other option, but before he knew what he was doing, his feet had carried him down to the parlor, where in the pitch black his hand fell upon the monkey's paw hanging by the door. It felt gnarled and repulsive. It made his skin crawl to touch it. He made his way back upstairs. His wife had lit a candle on the bedside table, and in the light of the flame, she looked more monster than human. Driven by madness, her ability to reason was gone. "Wish," she said. "No, please, it's wrong," he said feebly. He was afraid of her. "Wish," she said again, louder this time. "I wish my son alive again." He'd said it. Had he said it? Why did he say it? Neither of them moved. As before, he had dropped the monkey's paw on the floor. They stood opposite one another, staring at it. Mr. White slowly sunk into a chair and covered his face, but his wife strode with purpose to the window and raised the blind. And that's how they both stayed for a while, until the bedside candle burned down, then finally out. Relieved, Mr. White dragged himself back to bed. A short while later, he felt his wife get in beside him. Neither fell back asleep, but lay there in the dark, listening to the wind in the rafters, the creaks of the house, a mouse scurrying in the walls. All of these sounds that Mr. White had grown so accustomed to were now too much for him to bear. He lay a while, screwing up his courage, before sitting up and striking a match to go downstairs and get a fresh bedside candle. His match burnt out as he reached the bottom of the stairs, and he paused to light another. That was when he heard a new sound, which was not the wind in the rafters, or a creak of the house, or a mouse in the wall, but more like a knock, a soft knock on their front door. He froze, unlit match in hand. And the sound came again, a knock, on the front door. He bounded up the stairs and back to the bedroom and shut the door. The room was in pitch blackness, but he could still make out his wife sitting bolt upright in bed. "What was that?" she said. And then it came again, louder this time, a knock at the front door. His wife flew out of bed and he flew to block the door. "Herbert, it's Herbert," she screamed. Of course, the cemetery is 2 miles away. He needed time to get here," she exclaimed. She tried desperately to fight her way through her husband, blocking her path. "It's not," Mr. White cried. "It's not him anymore. For God's sake, whatever you do, don't let it in." "You're afraid of your own son?" she cried, and with renewed strength pushed past her husband and off into the dark house, headed directly for the front door. "Herbert," she screamed. "Herbert, I hear you. I'm coming." What had begun as slow rhythmic knocks were coming harder and faster now. "I'm here, Herbert. I'm right here," Mrs. White cried. Mr. White heard her turn the bolt, then slide the bottom deadbolt aside. He curled into a ball by the bed and covered his face like a child. He felt cold and hot and weak. He was going to be sick. She was going to do it. She was going to let him in. Let it in. Bam, bam, bam. Again came the pounding at the door. And then he heard his wife calling to him. Help me, she was saying. Help, I can't reach. She couldn't reach. She couldn't reach. She couldn't reach. She couldn't reach the top bolt. But she would. She would. Mr. White heard her hauling a chair across the floor from the parlor. Bam, bam, bam again on the door. Help me, she cried. In his mind, he cursed Major Morris. He cursed Ma and Maggins. He cursed the house. He cursed his wife. Most of all, he cursed the paw. That paw. The monkey's paw. Bam, bam, bam again on the door. Desperately, he threw himself on the carpet, arms sweeping wildly out before him. The paw, the paw. Bam, bam, bam. He heard the creak of the top bolt, and at the last second, the very last second, his hand closed around the monkey's paw, and he breathed his last and final wish. The pounding on the door ceased. He heard the chair dragged away from the front door, the door flung open, and felt an icy wind race through the house. Then, nothing. He heard nothing, until a long, painful wail of disappointment and despair emerged from his wife. Mr. White jolted to his feet and raced down the stairs to find her kneeling in front of the open doorway, the frozen wind gently blowing her hair. He paused by her side, and they both looked out into the dark, cold, empty night. He ran out to the gate, his bare feet punching through the ice of frozen muddy puddles. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. It's impossible to say where this last story began. Some say it's based on a true story, and it could be. It emerged in the 17th century, but really gained popularity in the 1830s when a song was written about the tale. This is the legend of Mistletoe Bough. As the story goes, a young couple were married on Christmas Day and were celebrating their nuptials with their friends and family in a big, beautiful English manor house in the countryside. It had been a long day for the young bride, but the party was still going well into the evening, and when someone suggested a game of hide and seek, she saw it as her chance to slip away and rest for a bit. The bride runs off to some faraway corner of the house where she can't even hear the other partygoers anymore and sits down to rest. After a moment, she realizes she should play along and find a place to hide. So she climbs into a large, empty wooden chest nearby and shuts the lid. And she waits. And she waits and she waits, and she realizes it's taking them an awfully long time to find her. Not wanting to ruin the game, she waits a little longer, but eventually she gets tired of waiting, cramped up in this dark trunk, so she tries to open the lid to get out. Except she can't open the lid. It's stuck shut. She presses harder and tries to use her back and her legs to kick and force the lid open, but she can't, and she begins to scream. Meanwhile, the guests have been running about the large house, finding guests hiding behind curtains and such, and as the game goes on, they realize they haven't found the bride yet. Suddenly, the game feels not so fun anymore, and panic starts to arise as everyone, the partygoers, the staff, everyone, is looking for the bride. They scour the house, but they can't find her, so they move the search to the grounds and woods surrounding the house. Meanwhile, our bride is screaming. But due to the heavy wood of the trunk and faraway location of the room and the noise of everyone calling and searching for her, they can't hear her. Hours have gone by now, and it's very late, almost the next morning, and the partygoers can see that they'll have to turn in and continue searching for her in the morning. The young groom is sick with worry, but he agrees. Meanwhile, our bride has exhausted herself. Her voice is hoarse, her body is aching, her fingernails are torn, and instead of screaming, she quietly starts to weep. The next morning, the search does resume, but as morning turns to afternoon and afternoon to evening again, someone starts to theorize that perhaps she ran off with someone else. It's happened before, young brides forced into marriages disappearing just before or shortly after their weddings, and the groom doesn't want to believe it. She wanted this marriage just as much as he did, but sadly, he's forced to consider the possibility, especially since he agrees that if she was indeed in the house, they most certainly would have found her by now. One by one, guests start to go home, and sadly console the young groom as they depart. And with each departure, the chances of our bride being found become less and less as the house empties. And soon, there's no one left to hear her screams. and the house is closed up for the winter. She thinks of her new husband and the life they planned and occasionally summons the energy to kick and scream and scratch at the inside of the trunk, but it's no use, and eventually she quietly slips away. Under the impression that his new wife was out there somewhere in the world, the groom never stopped looking for her his entire life. And 50 years later, an old man now, he finds himself near the old stately manor home where they'd celebrated their wedding, and for reasons beyond him, he feels drawn to visit it. He does visit the home and is overwhelmed with memories from the night, and he once more feels compelled to search the house. Maybe there's some overlooked clue, even 50 years later. He slowly and methodically goes through the whole house until he happens upon a room in a faraway corner with a plain door as such that one might not notice it if they didn't know to look for it. He opens the door and finds a room he doesn't think he's ever been in before. But he must have been. He searched the whole house, many times, everyone did. But did he? It's been so long and his memory isn't what it used to be these days. While he's turning these thoughts over, he spots a large, ornately carved wooden chest against the far wall, an impressive piece of craftsmanship. He steps closer and examines the outside and then tries to lift the lid, but it's stuck. From the outside, it's easy to see that it has a spring latch that has to be released before the trunk can open, and without thinking, he releases the latch and raises the lid. When to his utter shock and horror, he beholds inside the trunk a skeleton in a white wedding dress, streaked with dried blood, and a dead bouquet of flowers still clutched in its bony hands. He stumbles back along the floor and sees the inside of the trunk lid is crisscrossed with scratch marks. He realizes at last that he has found his bride. My friends, I hope you enjoyed those stories. I wish you all a wonderful, safe, and happy holiday with your friends and family. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.